Hello guys and welcome back to CS with Mr. G. If you are new to the channel, we are currently over halfway through our Unit 8 programming topic, where we have explored many concepts, especially the fundamental and some of the most important topics when it comes to programming. And if you followed this far, then well done, and I hope you've managed to grasp these key concepts and have a solid understanding of the algorithms that we've been looking at. And in today's lesson, what we are going to look at is quite a tricky topic, so please bear with me and take your time and just try your best to understand that what's going on when it comes to procedures and functions, where we have to understand what is meant by a procedure and a function, this word parameters, and then hopefully be able to use procedures and functions in programs where we will look at some examples in Python, and I will explain what's going on at each step and hopefully give you the understanding of why and when you would need to use a procedure or function given a scenario-based question. Then at the end, we will look at these two terms, local and global variables, which is quite easy to understand if you manage to understand what a procedure and a function is. So first and foremost, here's our basic definitions of both procedures and functions. And as you can see, a procedure or a function is a small block of code that does a particular job when it comes to our program. So we need to trace our minds back to that very first lesson in Unit 7 when we looked at problem solving and decomposition. And what we can do, if we can decompose our problems into smaller subtasks, we can then go on to create sub-programs within our main programs to essentially make what we consider an individual program within a bigger program. Now, all of this will make much more sense when we start to see it in action in Python. But some of the reasons why we use procedures and functions is that if we're using the same code to do multiple things within one program, we can just write it once in a function and then call this function when we need to do this specific code. So similar to a loop, in that a loop will repeat lines of code, but a function is set aside as its own little mini program that we can use when and where needed in order to fit into the algorithms that we are creating. So like we keep saying, decomposition is breaking the problem down into smaller chunks. And essentially, a function can be assigned to these smaller chunks to make it easier to solve, easier to manage. And like I've mentioned, save you writing lines and lines of code where we can just call upon our functions when they are needed. Now, what we'll do to demonstrate this is I'm going to jump straight into Python so we can see what's going on. But before we do that, the example I want to go through is something simple like making a piece of toast. If we just cast our minds back to the decomposition of a task, so something like making toast, if we break up the task of making toast into some subtasks, we know that making toast usually involves put the bread in the toaster. So we can class putting bread in the toaster as an individual task, and we're going to call this a subtask, which later on we will create our own function for when it comes to the actual program. The second thing would be to turn the toaster on, so heat the bread. That would be our second subtask. And then finally, we do something like put butter on it. So put butter toast. And again, we've got our main task of making toast split into three subtasks. We'll head straight into Python. And here you can see I have created three functions using the word def, which is short for defined. And what this does is it creates a mini program within the main program using the name you can see here. So def put bread in toaster means we have a function called put bread in toaster. And what happens inside this code is that we print out the line bread in. This is just a complete simple example. I'm just trying to demonstrate how it would look making toast in Python, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Secondly, we have the heating toast function. So def heat toast. So we use our traditional naming conventions, naming things something meaningful, just like we would any other variable or array. Then we have a third subtask, which is spread butter. And again, this is just a complete made up scenario representing the making toast. Now in Python, what's going to happen here is that when I run this code, absolutely nothing happens. As you can see, the process exited with return code 0, which means it ran with no problems, but nothing actually happened in the terminal window. And by all means, none of these print statements you can see here were actually executed. Now, what this means is that in order to run the code inside a function, we need to do something that we used a word for before in the presentation, which is to call a function or procedure. So to call a function, all you need to do is write the name of the function. So for example, toast, the brackets, these brackets here I'll explain more later, but by writing the name of the function here, we're essentially telling Python, okay Python, line 10, I want you to run the function heat toast. Now Python knows heat toast exists because it would have read def heat toast in line 4, but what it would have done is it would have put it to one side and just kept it there for when we actually called it in the program, which we have in line 10. So we run this now. As you can see, it prints out toasting in the terminal. So line 5 print toasting in this case was actually run. So as you can imagine, if we want to print out the whole thing, we'd have to run each function sequentially. So put bread in toaster, we heat the toast, and then finally we spread the butter. So as you can see, 1, 2, and 3 functions are called. And when we run the program, bread in, toasting, and butter spread. Now what we could do, and this is where we start to become clever with functions, is we could create another function called make toast. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the functions that are already made inside this function, and we're just going to call them in here instead. So put bread in toaster, heat the toast, and then finally spread the butter. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out a simple statement just to say toast is ready. So now what happens, I'm going to call the function make toast, and hopefully you've managed to piece together what's going to happen. So when I press run, it runs all 3, so bread in, toasting, and butter spread from the 3 individual functions, and then prints out toast is ready at the end. So I've put the functions inside this function and then only called the one function at the end. Now, why this is super useful is that I can use any of these functions later on in my program. So for example, if I want to make a meal cheese on toast, I can use the functions that already exist here, so bread in and toasting, but then add a different instruction to put cheese on it, but I'm not having to rewrite these lines of code because they already exist. So just as an example, let's make it. So def, which is defined, we're going to make cheese on toast. And to make cheese on toast, again, we need to put bread in the toaster. We need to heat the toast. Then I'll put butter on as well. Bread, butter. So as you can see, I'm not having to rewrite these lines of code because they already exist up here. Now I am going to need another function because I need to put cheese on. And I'm going to print put cheese on toast. Then I'm going to come back to the function make cheese on toast. And I'm going to call the function cheese. Then I'll print cheese on toast is ready. And I'm going to call the main function of make cheese on toast. I'm just going to change this one, cheese toast. Give it a run, bread in, toasting, butter spread, put cheese on toast is ready. So as you can see, guys, I didn't have to rewrite the lines of code within these functions. And as you can imagine, if functions start to become quite large and complex, this will save us hours of coding if we can just call these functions when it comes to a suitable scenario. Now back to our learning objective, we need to understand the difference between these two terms, procedures and functions, as they are two separate things when it comes to programming. What I've just showed you in Python with the toast example, that was an example of a procedure, as a procedure is essentially a function, but nothing is returned. So no value is given back to the program. It simply performs a task like printing, or it can update some data and change the value of a variable, for example, but it doesn't give any information back to the main program. A function is the complete opposite of that, and it will return a value and give something back to the main program, like in the example here. So in this example, I've got a function called add numbers, and these brackets, which you might have seen before in Python, these are what we call parameters, and what these are values that the function needs in order to perform its task. So our add numbers function is expecting 2 values, which we're going to label as A and B. And then when the function is run, it takes in these values and will do something with them. So in this example, A and B are passed into the function. So 2 numbers, for example, it's going to add them together and it's going to store the answer in the variable result. The result variable is then returned, which means given back to the main program. So then we could either print this result or use this result in another function or in another formula, but the result itself is given back to the main program. And like I said, guys, this is the main difference between a procedure and a function. Now in Python, when you see the word def or the letters DEF, this essentially means to make a function within Python. But when it comes to the paper 2 exam, you are expected to know the difference between the two things. And like I said, it's simply one returns a value and one does not return a value. So just by remembering that, guys, you will pick up marks in the exam. I've seen questions time and time again where you need to explain the difference between a procedure and a function. And if we just look at a really simple example of a procedure, we've got a procedure called greet. It takes in a parameter called name. So name will be a variable from the program and it prints out hello with the name and then an exclamation mark. So nothing is returned. You can't see return anywhere down here. And that's how we know it was a procedure, because like I said, no value is returned to the main program. So now if we take the function that we've just looked at and actually put it to some sort of use, you can see the first 3 lines, they remain the same. This is simply creating the function. It's not actually running it. Now, in this case, when I'm going to call the function, unlike in Python last time, where I simply just called the function by its name, now I'm going to run the function, take the return value from the function and store it in a variable. So here I've created a variable called sum, and it's going to contain the returned value from the function add numbers with the values 3 and 4 passed in. So when Python reaches this line of code, it knows already that a function exists called add numbers. It knows that. It then creates this variable sum. It knows that sum needs the function add numbers, so it will go to the function code and start to run it. It will also take the values that are in the brackets and it will put them into the function so the function can do something with it. So 3 will go in represented as A, and then 4 will be passed in represented as B. Then the function executes. A, which is 3, goes into here, and then B, which is 4, goes here. So the result will be 3 plus 4, and the answer will be stored in the variable result. Then the result is returned, which means it's given back to the main program, and essentially, in our example, stored in the variable sum. Then if I print out the sum, it will simply print out the value 7, as this was the returned result from the function. So give this a go yourself. Create the function, then assign the result to a variable and play around with the numbers that are being passed in to the function just to make sure it works. And so it gives you a better understanding of what's going on with all of these values and variables that we can see. Now let me just clear the screen and go over one more word that we need to know. I've mentioned before that in the brackets after the function, these are known as the parameters. And this is the data that's being passed into the function from outside in the main program. Now, where we actually give these parameters a value, so here in this example, 3 and 4 in this case are what we call arguments. And these are 2 more terms that we need to know when it comes to the paper 2 exam. So in this case, the arguments are 3 and 4. They're passed into the function parameters as A and B are put into the function here and are simply added together. So these are the keywords that I really need you to focus on, parameters and arguments, as again, simple questions could come up where you have to simply define or identify these things in some example pseudocode. Now, when it comes to a procedure, these terms remain the same. As you can see here, we've got the name parameter. And again, this is a variable called name, and it will expect this variable from outside of the function in the main program. And here, I've simply called the function. This time, I'm not assigning it to a variable because there is no return value to actually store. So I simply call the function using its name. And like before with the toast function in Python, however, this time inside the brackets, I'm going to put an argument as this procedure is expecting one when it executes the code. So Alice, in this case, is the argument being passed in to the parameter name. Name is then put in this string here, and it will simply print out hello, and then the name that's passed in, which is Alice. And again, the reason why we would do this is that we can call this procedure whenever we like in our code. All we need to do is change the argument here every time that we run it. And then just to go over the pseudocode, because we are expected to know the pseudocode for both procedures and functions, rather than the word def, which is short for defined, we write the word function if it's a function or procedure if it's a procedure. Now this first example is the function for add numbers. So as you can see, I've written function in capital letters for pseudocode. The name of the function goes here, just like in Python. And then the parameters A and B are almost the same. However, in pseudocode, we need to declare what type of data they are going to be. So in this example, we know that A and B were integers, as it's going to add them together. And we also need to declare what type of data is coming back. So as you can see, all of this here does not exist in Python. This is strictly pseudocode, but it is something that we need to do and practice. Once we enter the function, as we can see, result becomes A plus B, which we should be familiar with by now. And of course, return result is very similar to the Python equivalent. We also need to declare the end function, which we don't in Python. This is important, but again, you should be used to this in pseudocode, as you need to end any other concept such as ifs or loops. We always end them in pseudocode. Then we assign the return value of the function into the variable sum, just like here, and output sum, just like here. So that is a pseudocode alternative, guys. And of course, for the procedure, it's very similar. You don't use the word function, you use the word procedure. You give it a name, just like before. The parameter, we again need to declare what data type it is, which we don't in Python. Then we output hello name, very similar to Python, and then of course end the procedure. And then what is good practice in pseudocode, guys, if we use the word call rather than just writing the name of the function or the procedure, this is good practice. Although in the exam, if you did miss this, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So like I briefly mentioned there, guys, when we define our procedures and functions in pseudocode, we need to obviously declare what type of data type is going to be included. This is for both parameters being passed in and also the data type of return values, obviously for functions only. So if I just show you the labels for this, the name of the procedure or the function is A, any parameters passed in to the procedure or function is labeled B, and we include their data type. And then finally C, functions only is the data type being returned. So this is called a definition, and in Python, as we've seen, it's DEF. And again, just to go over those keywords, parameters and arguments. Parameters, we can consider the placeholders or labels for data that's being put into the function. So we can imagine them as empty boxes that are going to contain the values that we give to the function when we actually run it. So in the greet example, name is the parameter that's being passed in. It's the placeholder, and that's going to store the variable that we give it when we call the function. And like I've mentioned, the variable being passed into the parameter is what we call an argument. So in this case, the argument will be Alice. And in the function that we seen earlier for adding numbers, the arguments would be 3 and 4, and the parameters are A and B. And then to finish off are our final keywords. They are local and global variables. A local variable is something that is created inside a function or procedure. So I'll show you an example in a minute. But what's important for a local variable is that this only exists inside the function or procedure in which it's created. It cannot be used outside of it, only within the function. A global variable is created outside of the function and can be accessed anywhere, which means it can be used anywhere in the program, and it can also be passed into functions or procedures using the methods that we've just seen as parameters and then being passed in as an argument. So just a couple of examples. In the greet procedure that we've seen earlier, name I've changed and I've put inside the procedure. So name is created inside the procedure. So that means it's now a local variable and it cannot be used anywhere outside of this procedure. It can only be used within the greet procedure itself. In this example on the right hand side, the name Alice was declared before the procedure. As you can see, the procedure is defined here. So that means it's a global variable and it can be used across the whole program. So if we used any other functions further down, we could use the name variable here as it's available anywhere in the program as it is global. So just to finish off, guys, we're not going to do a task in this lesson. What we will do in the following lessons is I will start to use functions and procedures in the examples. Today's lesson is just about understanding what is meant by procedures and functions. So hopefully we can tick this learning objective off. Then with practice, we will start to use procedures and functions with or without parameters. So that will just come with time and practice. And then finally, the terms local and global variables mentioned at the end there. Hopefully that makes sense. But like I said, the purpose of this lesson is to simply understand what is meant by them. Being able to use them, we will focus on later on in the course. So as always, guys, thank you very much for watching. There are many more concepts that are as difficult as procedures and functions. So well done for making it this far. And like I said, we will have more practice in the last few lessons of Unit 8, which will all follow this video.